Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted to be again with Qaiser. Assalamu alaikum, Qaiser bhai. How are you doing?
Walaikum assalam, alhamdulillah. Absolutely fine. Yourself?
Good, good. You've been quite busy recently. You've had an interview with Rupert Sheldrake, one of the legends, and also Denis Noble, who
Yeah,
you had
it's been,
an interview with.
yeah, that's been a bit of journey away from um, the type of people I usually talk to, where after talking you feel there is a lot to be left desired for, and you think that you would want to have a better use of your time, and you feel that we didn't quite hit the mark. But then I had back-to-back podcasts with people of the very high intellect, and that's when you felt, well, this is what we've been missing, and hopefully we will see if we can keep that going.
Absolutely. And the first thing I wanted to cover about your interview with Denis Noble is the Desi secularists that you're normally antagonizing in Pakistan. They've completely misunderstood the very significance of this interview by hanging on to some really tertiary issues. They've not seen the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that Denis Noble has had a myriad of interactions all over the internet with very different people from backgrounds as diverse as his colleagues and his opponents like Dawkins, journalists from various outlets. However, nobody has actually spoken to him very directly about his belief in God. And no one's actually had a very direct conversation with him about why we believe in God. And that was totally missed out, because one of the things that I wanted to just highlight here is Noble is not only on the opposite spectrum biologically when it comes to evolutionary theory. He rejects Neo-Darwinism and Dawkins accepts it. He is on the opposite spectrum when it comes to the understanding of theology and its relation to science, where you have Dawkins with a very antagonizing behavior towards believers. Noble himself doesn't believe in the conventional way. He's best described as maybe an agnostic or an atheist, but he's very much open to the discussion, and he has a totally different attitude of the relationship between science and God than Dawkins does. And this magnificent point that this is why I was so excited to have you on here, this magnificent point that you highlighted in your discussion with him, and that deep discussion that you had of a theological nature was completely ignored by these Desi secularists. And they started saying, well, Darwinism is not the same as Neo-Darwinism and all this stuff, which is really tertiary to the really important part of the lecture, of the talk rather, between you two, which was the theological aspect.
Well, that's very true, and this is unfortunately one of the problems we have in this part of the world, where we have certain views, and they are used in a political way, and everything has to be spinned in a way that it seems like you have won the argument, or you're just trying to defend something, whereas that was never the point there, as you quite rightly pointed out. The thing is that if you construct your paradigm, or at least this is what you pretend, that look, we are not people of faith, we are people of evidence, and we will follow wherever evidence leads us to, and that's that. But then you need to just you need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. If that actually happens, you need to show something for it, that this is what we are doing. But unfortunately, it's just talk the talk. It's no more than that, which means that because they are holding on to this, the view of Darwinism, of any form of it, anything that they believe could potentially cause any harm to it, they would defend it with tooth and nail and everything else that they've got. And that is exactly goes against what they're standing for, because so far as they are concerned, we are supposed to be the regressives who are the people of faith, and they are supposed to be the progressives who are the people of evidence. But all of a sudden, when they defend something like that, it's almost like if they can't, they will lose their faith. Well, that takes the entire claim of rationality, and basically the pretense goes away. And at the same time, I must also give credit to Dr. Noble that he, I wasn't aware that he is philosophically trained to this level, that he knew everything I was talking about. And I am registering my ignorance here. Obviously, he is a person of extreme stature. Obviously, I can't say that it's a surprise to me, but it's a surprise to me that he didn't much talk about that side of his life. I mean, when it comes to understanding the theology or understanding the philosophy stroke theology, and he was humble enough to state where the limitations of science are, and he is open enough to accept other people's metaphysics as well, which I believe is a basic prerequisite for anyone who we call an intellectual. It's very refreshing. Was amazing to see. He's an amazing human being, despite all the difference. And he knew, by the way, for there is. I like to put this on record as well, that some people actually they try to insinuate that I may have lured him into a trap of doing the podcast with a God believer. Now he knew that. We had a little sort of a pre-podcast, if you like. So he wanted to know exactly where I come from, and I made it very clear that, look, I don't believe in any rendition of evolutionary theory, be it the classical Darwinism or the Neo-Darwinism or the theistic version of it, or the Lamarckian or third way, or whatever you want to call it. Any of those, I don't believe in them. But I respect you enough that you have a very strong view, and we have a common ground because we don't believe, at least, that Neo-Darwinism is not scientific. So he knew exactly where I was coming from, and he was still generous enough to give me time. And I think it was a job well done, or at least it made people to think in alternatives, which I think was the purpose of the conversation, and we did achieve that.
Absolutely. And for those who really want to understand how open Noble is to these types of discussions, or working with people from diverse backgrounds, one of the close associates of Denis Noble is Perry Marshall. Perry Marshall is someone who used to be an intelligent design proponent, but then he switched to the third way of evolution and his famous book, Evolution 2.0, which is essentially a bridge between Neo-Darwinism and intelligent design by having, theology in its rightful place, science in a particular place, and to accept the findings of the third way of evolution. Now, it was at the Royal Society meeting, a particular meeting that you'll see online, that Denis Noble actually acknowledged Perry Marshall, who was at the table with him, and lifted up his book, Evolution 2.0, as a good book, as a book that he would recommend. So, for those who are still trying to say, well, no, these people, these evolutionists, all of them are atheists, and, all of them don't believe in God, and all of them, just like Dawkins, want to, have that sort of attitude towards religion. It's not just your interaction, Qaiser, with Noble that shows that actually he's quite balanced when it comes to these things. And he actually holds the view that we've been saying for a very long time, which is the view that science is theologically neutral. You can be a scientist and believe in God or not believe in God. Science runs by methodological naturalism, which doesn't equal philosophical naturalism. So the greatest benefit of that interaction that you had with Noble was to finally put to rest that we know for sure that there's many evolutionists out there, and as eminent as Noble is, these types of evolutionists who don't hold on to that Dawkins type of hardcore view against biological design, who at least understand theology has its place, philosophy has its place, science has its place. And also something else that Noble said, which I thought was really, really interesting in a separate lecture, there's no such thing as philosophy v science, which is why he also acknowledges the role of philosophy when it comes to science. Another thing I wanted to highlight and get your perspective on as well. There were some commentators afterwards who were trying to make it look like, oh, he's not denying evolution. Yeah, but you never said he was denying evolution. No one ever said he's denying evolution. Another thing to keep in mind is, oh, he's not denying Darwinism, he's denying Neo-Darwinism. Well, this
Yeah.
is quite a problematic statement because it's loaded. Let me explain what Noble's view is. And his view is articulated in his discussion with Dawkins in their debate that they had 2 years ago on Hey on Why. In that discussion, what you find is Darwinism defined by Richard Dawkins is Neo-Darwinism. Darwinism defined by Denis Noble is basically Lamarckian evolution plus natural selection plus Darwin's ideas. So in fact, during the debate, there was a point in which Denis Noble said, I am a good Darwinian. But before that, he said Darwin himself was a Lamarckian. So we have to understand when these people are saying, well, Denis Noble's still a Darwinist. Yeah, he's a Darwinist who Richard Dawkins has described as a 6th edition Darwinist, meaning a Darwinist who believes in Lamarckian mechanisms. And I want to just explain something to the audience. Neo-Darwinism is the dominant idea in evolutionary biology, and to call Denis Noble a Darwinist as if he's a Neo-Darwinist is to undermine everything he's done for the last 20 years. So if anything, when we do use the term Darwinism, we are referring to Neo-Darwinism. But all of this is nitpicking. The fact is, your interaction with him and the clip that I've just found now that we're going to play soon, inshallah, that is when you spoke to him theologically. And that's what these Desi secularists who've been attacking you since that interview's been out don't understand, that theological discussion you had with him, without even commentary, if we just play it, that is sufficient to put to rest many of the tropes that they've been using against us.
Well, there's well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for being so very kind. I mean, you are one of the pioneers of this side of things. I mean, you've been working online in Speaker's Corner in different places, and all the kind and encouraging words you were saying about me and the podcast. I mean, such a degree for someone like me. So I do thank you for that. Before you play the video, there's one thing I like to point out here, that if you look at the people, the Darwinists, so to speak, what we've been able to achieve after this debate is that I have been saying this for a very long period of time, that evolution is not a well-identified theory. It's not a well-defined theory even. There are so many different renditions of it, and even those, there are so many different sub-renditions of it, different explanations of it. And they would say, oh, no, it's not like a religion where you have so many different sects. I said, well, it's not like a religion, but it surely have different sects. It does. So when you say that whether I believe in evolution, I mean, that is not a sufficiently clear question, because I need to be able to respond to it. And to be able to do so, I need to know what exactly am I responding to. So you need to tell me if you're talking about the Lamarckian rendition of it, or the Darwinist, or the Neo-Darwinist, or the third way, which fairly close to Lamarckian. But you have to explain what exactly you're talking about. And after this podcast, it has become clear, because all the people who've been saying that, no, there is no such thing as that many different sects or divisions of evolution, the very people are now saying that, oh, by the way, Dr. Noble only said that Neo-Darwinism is wrong. Oh, yeah, it doesn't mean evolution is wrong, but that's exactly what I've been saying, that there are so many different versions of it. But at least now you have come to a point where you've started to understand that Neo-Darwinism is something which is, scientifically speaking, not supported. But then that opens up you to an even bigger problem, which is that you've already rejected all the other versions beforehand. For example, Lamarck, you used to acknowledge the existence of it, but then you would always say, well, that is unscientific because he hasn't been able to show this, that, and the other. Okay, discarded. How about theistic evolution? Oh, no, because that has the element of God, therefore, no, that can't be. Darwinism itself, oh, that's same as Neo-Darwinism. Okay, what else do we have? ID, oh, no, that's not even scientific theory. Okay, fine. You've whether you have the right reasons or the wrong reasons, but you do have the reasons to reject all of those. So the only thing you were left with was Neo-Darwinism. That is now a problem, because even that is no longer scientifically supported, or is not, scientifically speaking, is provable anymore. So if you had all the other versions, you already discarded them beforehand, and the one you were left standing with, well, even that is gone, then there is no more evolution. This is what you need to understand. And so far as I'm concerned, I agree with all the Darwinists, Desi or international level, whoever believe that all the other evolutions are wrong, or all the other renditions of it are wrong. All I do is, with agreeing with you on all of those, I add one more to it. That's it, which is Neo-Darwinism. And the reason I do that is because that is your textbook biology. It's based on that. The students, their progression depends on whether or not they accept this or not. This is how big it is. So when you say that, 98% scientists believe, that itself is not the correct number. But even if we are to take that, what you mean is that 98% of scientists, they believe in Neo-Darwinism is to be true. All of a sudden, their scientific credentials are into the question, because we are going to ask them the question. And if they don't have the answers, which they don't, or you don't have the answers, then this is exactly what we've been saying. We are not against science. We like to ask certain questions because this is what's very much part of the scientific tradition and the temperament of it. If you don't have the answers, well, that's not on me. That's not on Sabur. It's not on Dr. Noble. All we do is we just ask questions. You either answer them or you accept that this is not right. And if this isn't right, then what do you have to go by? Because all the others you had already rejected beforehand.
Yeah, and what's interesting about what you're saying is the fact that there are different models, that's not acknowledged, but that's the very beauty of science, that you'll have many different models. The other thing to keep in mind is, even if the third way of evolution did not exist, right? It just didn't exist. And remember, Noble himself was a neo-Darwinist at a point before he broke off. The most important point here is, whether it's neo-Darwinism or the third way of evolution, or neo-Lamarckism or neo-mutationism or evolution by self-organization or anything else, none of this necessarily leads to atheism. Because we have to remember, where did this entire discussion originate? It originated with the God delusion. It was people like Richard Dawkins who used the central argument in their book that because Darwinism is true, there is no design. Because Darwinism is true, God most likely doesn't exist. Because Darwinism is true, therefore, these are the moral implications of life. Therefore, the purpose of life, the ultimate rationale of life, like he says in The Selfish Gene, is to propagate our genes. That's the ultimate. So we now have philosophical implications being made, theological implications being made from a particular model. That's where the battle really started. So for me, even if Denis Noble was still a neo-Darwinist, I think Denis Noble would say the same thing, which is science is theologically neutral. Because one of the things which I really like that you acknowledged in the debate in the discussion with him about, on his website, The Third Way of Evolution, it makes it very clear they're not about intelligent design, they're not about creationism, and they're a separate program. And you said, well, Noble, I am an intelligent design proponent. I know it says this on your website. However, I do use the third way of evolution as a argument for design. And Noble goes, well, whatever. Like, he's fine. Like, I want to make a distinction here. The data of third way of evolution can be used for atheistic or theistic implications. The data itself is the data. It's neutral. So I really love the fact that you opened with him, and then later on you actually made a argument for God.
Yeah, just one thing I like to put on record, that I believe in intelligent design as a God believer, but there is also intelligent design as the product of the Discovery Institute. That's I'm not proponent of, but yes, I do believe in things being created with intelligence. I'm not an evolutionist for that matter. So yeah, I think it's good to be open and say, look, I mean, we've got so many problems with Neo-Darwinism, and you do dissuade people on your website, please don't use our stuff. But hey, we do it anyway because it's based on truth, and you don't mind that. And then surely he didn't. So yeah, I think that was a good moment.
Absolutely. So I'm going to play my favorite part of the debate. And in fact, if this was the only thing that you discussed with him and then the internet cut out, right? I think the objective for the Dawah sector, right, the entire Dawah sector would have been phenomenal. Just this clip that, this small interaction that you have with him.
This stage making a theological case for God, but it's more of a philosophical case for God. And let me make the argument and present the case. And I want to make sure that I fully express myself for your benefit. So it might take a minute to 2 minutes, but I'll try to be as quick as I can. We hold that there are only two types of things, either contingent beings or necessary beings. Contingent things, they need to have two essential characteristics that make them contingent. Number one, that they are dependent on something else. And number two, they cannot explain the existence and the purpose of their existence themselves. So you have to find those explanations elsewhere. And a necessary being, by definition, is something that is impossible to not exist. It is going to exist. It's impossible for it to not exist. So with that understanding, we apply a question on the biological entities, the organisms, that whether the organisms are necessary or are they contingent. And the answer is, well, they are contingent, because whilst we know that they do exist, but it's perfectly possible that they don't, which means that they don't necessarily exist. Now, if they don't necessarily exist, then their existence is contingent. And if they can't explain the existence, the purpose, and the agency, that means that has to be sought elsewhere. And when we go elsewhere and look for the explanation, and we will find the explanation, then we ask the same question, whether this explanation was contingent or was it necessary. And then we look at another, if that explanation is not necessary, and then we go backwards on this sequence of cause and effect, and finally we conclude that there has to be a first uncaused cause that explains everything. Otherwise, we will end up in the realm of infinite regress, and that is pretty much unthinkable exercise. It simply doesn't solve anything. So at this stage, we don't go whether it's Allah who has done it, or Jesus, or Christian, or anybody else for that matter. We just say that it has to be a creator, and that's not a theological case. So it's not a theological case, it's more of a philosophical case. And this is how we start our journey and end up believing in God.
Well, it even led some philosophers, Spinoza notably, to a very interesting view of what he thought as you put it, the first cause was. And he put it in Latin, Deus sive natura, God or the universe or nature. Nature, of course, was being used there for the world. And of course, he was kicked out of his Amsterdam synagogue for having these views. That's another story. Don't need to go into that. No, that's right. But I fully understand the argument, and I go to the point of saying, well, the one thing I think I cannot answer is that, because coming back now to the question of the origin of life, that's still an open question. Of course, there's a very strong natural tendency for scientists to think somehow or other we'll understand the chemistry and the physics of the world such that we can then understand the way in which a living organism can come together. But we don't have that knowledge at the moment. And I take it as an open issue. That's why the last chapter of my book, Dance to the Tune of Life, has the title, The Relativity of Epistemology. That remain open to the possibility that we've got our understanding of the world deeply wrong. And isn't that what the cosmologists are now faced with? You know, we developed from very good observations made with earlier telescopes the theory that we know when the universe was formed, where the universe as we know it, we put it at 13.8 billion years ago, that it started off as an extremely compact thing, which exploded out and developed into what we now see. But that's a theory.
Yeah.
Nobody can say with any certainty that is correct. And what people are doing now that the James Webb Telescope is producing more and more information is re-examining that theory, right down to the fundamentals of what actually do we mean by some of the terms we are using. Hawking, of course, went so far with the so-called Big Bang model. He went so far as to say, well, it was the invention of time, if you want to call it that, which is very strange. I don't even begin to understand that. You know, I am to some extent philosophically trained, and I respect a lot of philosophy. I think the arguments from, for example, Descartes in the 17th century as to how we have agency but animals don't. Well, Darwin would certainly not have agreed with that. I think it's absurd. And the arguments that occurred between, well, not directly between him and Spinoza, but Spinoza represented the other extreme. You know, you can, once you give some sense of integrative activity, I think that's the way we put it in modern language, to an organism, you're moving to very, very different issues that are raised. And he, as a philosopher, I think, fully understood that. But to come back to the point, I feel that we have to remain open to the possibility that our understanding of the universe is, at the moment, seriously in question as to how much we really do understand. We do not know yet how to resolve conflicts between our ideas of quantum mechanics and our ideas of special and general relativity. We don't know, therefore, how to produce a complete account of what we observe. And for so long as that is true, and it may always be true as far as I know, I think we should remain open. That's why I give, let me put it this way, philosophically, metaphysical speculation, because that's what I would call it, reign to try and see what one can understand. And metaphysics should not be regarded as necessarily religious. I know this is a contentious issue, but I'm trying to explain my own position as carefully as I can, as you.
Okay, so before we get into the this particular aspect of what he thinks about metaphysics being religiously free, that segment, it had quite a few things, and I wanted to break it down per level. Now, previously on my channel, with the viewers watching, I've already broken down the assumptions of Neo-Darwinism and Denis Noble's answer. Richard Dawkins and Denis Noble had the debate. It's been broken down on my channel many times. The new book's coming out, which inshallah is going to have a dedicated breakdown of literally every single thing in the debate. So all of that's there. I want to focus this live stream on the theological aspects. So the first thing I want to do is talk about attitudes. Now, the attitude of Richard Dawkins to design, or the argument for God using any particular avenue, whether it's the moral argument or it's the contingency argument, is dismissive and negative. I just want to share something with you, right? In 2011, at the World Atheist Convention in Ireland, we were all out there. So it was myself, Hamza Sotzis, Adnan Rashid. So we were all out there, right? So I was outside the conference and we were giving out literature. Inside the conference was Hamza and Adnan. Now, Richard Dawkins was there, Aaron Ra was there, all these, Rebecca Watson, all these people were there, right? So I said to Adnan, you know, Dawkins in his book, he says this about design, and basically design is tempting to basically believe in design, or design is illusory, but it's not basically true. So what happens is during the Q&A, and this is, you'll find this video on the internet, right? You can't see Adnan in the video clip because the camera's focused on Richard Dawkins, but you can hear Adnan's voice, right? So Adnan asks him the question, well, in your book, you talk about design, but then you say that this design is basically a illusion of a design, right? That it's not actually God. It's basically natural selection being the design. So he just asked a question, and Richard Dawkins was so dismissive. He said something like, "How dare you?" And he, just started just going off on one. And the question was very much more, I would say, placid than what you put to Noble. What you put to Noble was a detailed argument, contingency argument, but you also spoke about agency, and there's other times that you made a philosophical argument and then a theological one. You're having a long, extended discussion with somebody who, I mean, I would describe Denis Noble as an atheist, according to the other videos that I've seen. But his reaction is the opposite of the reaction that Richard Dawkins gave Adnan Rashid. So the first thing I want to ask you about is attitude. Don't you find that the attitude of new atheists, right, which sadly these Desi secularists and other people have adopted towards religious believers, this attitude will never facilitate a functioning dialogue between theists and atheists?
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, you don't want to have a dialogue, because when you have a dialogue, then you have to listen to other people as well. And the entire enterprise of new atheism is designed to have just the one-way conversation, where you get to be the judge, jury, and executioner. Other people, they have to explain, and then it is your absolute prerogative to ascertain as to whether or not this explanation is good enough, irrespective of whether or not you understand the religion. This is and that is why I said to Hijab when we had the podcast here in Pakistan that I believe these new atheists, they are far more dangerous now that they've gone away from the camera, or at least they're not doing their work as much as they used to. Now they are a lot more dangerous than they were before. And the reason I believe that is because what they've been able to show the world is that it's perfectly possible to offend religion, Islam in particular, and you get more fame and more money, and the more dismissive or other ideas of other ideas you become, the better you will be treated, and in the process you will make money. Obviously, and there's going to be a lot of fame, and they've been able to show this to the world. And even when they sort of went away from this limelight. Obviously, Hitchens died, and Dennett went back to philosophy. Richard Dawkins, I think he had to just go away to do I don't know exactly what. And Sam Harris went back to his neuroscience and those areas. But because they've been able to show to the world that this is a possibility, that created a whole new rat race. Everybody wanted to become new Dawkins, and everybody wanted to become new Harris and Hitchens. Out of respect to Daniel Dennett, I would say that many people wanted to become him. And I say this respect because he actually had a bit of philosophical flair. Not that I agree with everything he said, but he was one of the better ones. He was only one who was better among these four. So that's what makes these people more dangerous, because of this rat race. And this is their behavior translates into the people who want to fill their shoes. And this is the problem we are dealing with now. As for Dr. Noble and Richard Dawkins together, I wouldn't even put them together, honestly speaking, because it was such a refreshing experience for me that I was speaking to a scientist who, for all practical purposes, is a traditional scientist, or at least how a traditional scientist ought to be. But he was so welcoming to other ideas. He listened and he agreed and disagreed wherever he had to. And it was a very nice conversation. Problem with Richard Dawkins is that he acts exactly like the things that he opposes. For example, he doesn't like the Inquisitions, but he is the master of verbal inquisitions. The way he responded to Adnan Rashid, for example, the way he responded to another young lady, I don't know her name, but this is very well-viewed video on YouTube, where she asked a question on evolution, and instead of answering, Richard Dawkins asked him, where did you get your degree from? Which means that I'm pulling the authority over you because I've got a degree and you probably don't. But isn't that exactly what led to the decline of church? Because of this behavior. And that is what you condemn. But that's exactly what you are doing now, which is probably, and the question, I mean, I've been speaking to people for a very long period of time, and I like to understand why people behave the way they do. And so far as my conclusion is concerned, and people may disagree with it, is that if you don't have much to offer, there are only two things you can do. Either create the conversation in a way where you get to question other people, or option number two is that you repeat more of the same. So essentially, you end up doing the same thing. And, that lack of knowledge that you have, you fill that with arrogance. So Richard Dawkins, for example, he believes Islam to be evil, but much later than making these statements, he admitted that he's never read Quran. So basically what he was saying was, this is a scientific conversation. I don't want to go into his, I'm just trying to make a point, the type of personality he carries, that he doesn't know what he's disagreeing with. There's a huge lack of knowledge. Now, what do you fill that gap with? Arrogance, attitude. And that's what they've been doing. And that's why he's not been, I mean, for the first time he spoke to someone, or not a problem, I shouldn't say the first time. I mean, every time when he spoke to someone who knew evolution or science, Richard Dawkins was very quickly out of his depth. His conversation with Dr. Noble is manifestly evident that he had no idea what he was talking about. He was talking about as if last 20 years just didn't happen to him. The developments in the science, I mean, how far the science has gone. And now he has written a book, which I haven't read, but from what I understand from Dr. Noble, that he dedicated a chapter in that book, I believe it's chapter 8, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong about that. He dedicated that chapter answering all the questions raised by Dr. Noble, but according to Dr. Noble, he just repeated the same thing, whatever he said on the stage. I mean, if you're wrong once and you repeat it, well, guess what? You're wrong twice. It just doesn't make you right. And that sort of situation we're dealing with.
So it's really interesting you bring that point out, because I was waiting for this book for a long time. So I got it on Kindle. As soon as it came out, I went to that chapter and I read it. And what I basically realized is he literally did not say anything new. So the most important point which Denis Noble raised against Richard Dawkins' perspective, genome reorganization, agency, causality, the very fact that the Human Genome Project does not fit the Neo-Darwinian predictions, everything in regards to holism, reductionism, like Richard Dawkins simply repeated his selfish gene mantra, even to the point that if you were to read that chapter, you would say, this is Richard Dawkins simply taking his speech with Noble and writing it as a chapter. He doesn't offer anything new. And what's surprising is it took him 2 years, because the debate happened in 2020. 2024, the book was going to be out. Now, he was actually asked by someone who interviewed Denis Noble about this book and about doing a podcast with them in regards to the debate that took place. And this was basically Dawkins' response was, well, my answer to Noble is coming out later on in the year. He said this last year. But it was so disappointing that in the Genetic Book of the Dead, and I recommend anyone who thinks that what I'm saying is far-fetched or not true, go and download the book, have a read of it, and what you will find is Richard Dawkins does not add an inch more to what he said in 2022. In fact, it gets worse. What gets worse about it is he's omitting the glaring problems which Denis Noble highlighted to him. For example, the crystal metaphor. The crystal metaphor goes back to Schrödinger, his book, What is Life? And the idea that you can have DNA as a self-replicator and the cell or the body is the vehicle. So the vehicle replicator distinction, all of that's been decisively refuted just due to proofreading. But there's loads of other reasons why we should reject them. But just the proofreading mechanism, which is something so essential and necessary for the organism that the organism would die without it. Dawkins heard in detail the answer that Denis Noble gave for why DNA doesn't replicate like a crystal, and the vehicle replicator distinction is invalid. Also, the proofreading example is something which is so abundantly clear, there's no reason for him to deny. Missing, he doesn't refute that point. He doesn't acknowledge that point. He doesn't realize, wait a minute, this is something I need to deal with. No, none of that is basically going on. When it comes down to the Wiseman barrier being absolutely destroyed, right?
Yeah.
When it comes down to Darwin's gemmules, right? These vesicles which have been discovered, which travel from the soma to the germ cells, and the epigenetics driving that adaptive evolutionary change, all of that stuff, guess it, he doesn't deal with it. He doesn't deal with it.
I don't suppose he even understands that. And the reason I say this is not an offering. This is not my attempt of offering any contempt to him. Sorry to interject. That is exactly what Denis Noble said in an interview afterwards. He said, Richard Dawkins doesn't even understand what I'm saying. Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And this is not my attempt of offering any insult to Dr. Dawkins. Certainly not. But the reason I believe that is because, you see, one of the better ways of examining a claim, usually a philosophical claim, is by applying the merit of that claim onto the claim itself, and then see if it holds the water or it doesn't. So for Dr. Dawkins to say that the whole idea of selfish gene, and that being the central driver for evolution, or the blueprint of life and everything else that goes with it, and the body being the carrier and machines and so forth. Well, this is not a scientific claim, because at best this is an assertion which is drawn upon by looking at certain data. And the reason we say this is not a scientific claim, because there is no way by which we can falsify that, because we don't know why genes are doing what they're doing. We can just see that they are doing it. But let's entertain this idea for a minute, that this is the whole, everything comes down to the selfish gene. But what does it mean for a gene to be selfish? If I accept that gene can be selfish, well, then the very next thing I will have to accept is that a gene cannot be selfish without having an agency. And that is exactly what you're disagreeing with.
Yes.
So I'm not entirely sure how far you can take that argument. And Dr. Noble is much more clear on this. So look, genes, all the chemicals, they do what chemicals do. They bond. Now, within that, when that happens, obviously we have enzymes who, any errors that happen during the application, they correct them. And then we have the whole process from DNA to RNA and the verification of it, and then translating that code into the proteins in the ribosome. We see there's a very precise process there, and the genes certainly can't decide that from themselves. So if you derive an argument of agency there, that's a lot more plausible than anything else. But what one can't do is to say that genes are selfish, but they don't have any agency. Well, they can't be selfish without having the agency.
You know, that is such a fantastic point, and thank you for bringing that up, because that's an intellectual roundhouse kick. It's so simple. I want to repeat it, because I don't think it's one of those things we can just mention once and move ahead. As Denis Noble and Raymond Noble, in their book Understanding Living Systems, which is the latest book on this particular topic for anyone that wants to understand, as they make abundantly clear, the selfish gene concept is wrong conceptually, philosophically, scientifically, and as you pointed out, is incoherent. So like you said, for something to be selfish, it must have the ability to not be selfish, and it chose to be selfish, which means it has agency. But it gets worse, because if you believe in genetic determinism, and whether they like it or not, that's what the selfish gene is about. They first they try and say you know, you know, at the end of the day, genes created us mind and body, and they go down the genetic determinism route. And then afterwards, in his debate with Lennox, John Lennox, Richard Dawkins says, well, we have to rebel against our genes. And Lennox says, well, what is it that rebels? If genes created us mind and body, what is it that rebels? And the funny thing is, the really funny thing is this: genes have a particular definition today, but that's not the traditional definition that they had. The definition that Dawkins uses in The Selfish Gene, and for The Selfish Gene to be a coherent book, he has to use in The Selfish Gene the concept that genes are strands of DNA. That's it. Particular strands of DNA. Okay. The problem is he also uses a separate definition of gene as anything that is inherited. And he did this in his debate with Lynn Margulis, in which Richard Dawkins was debating Lynn Margulis in Oxford, and Denis Noble was hosting the debate. And what did Richard Dawkins do when he was confronted with the fact that there is inheritance beyond the genome? He beyond just, you know, the standard understanding. He said, well, that can be accepted within the broad, basically the broad church of the Selfish Gene, as in anything that is inherited, he will call it an honorary gene. The problem is that's a conceptual muddle. You can't use two different definitions of gene. So the problem that that arises with Dawkins' understanding is not just something confined to the fact that his theory doesn't match the scientific evidence. His theory, even if it never had scientific problems, it has conceptual problems because it uses different slippery definitions of gene when you're dealing with different contexts. And Noble says you can't do that. You simply can't do that. It's not coherent.
And even for Dr. Dawkins, he needs to understand that he can't do that, because his second definition, if anything, it would take him closer to Lamarckian explanation, the being inheritance and everything else. But that's exactly what you stand against. So what problem are you solving there? This is basically in incoherence pro max level.
Yeah. So this is actually quite interesting, because when in the debate you had Dawkins basically saying, I don't like what you've said about Lamarck is back, and they're going back and forth about, okay, what is the evidence? What is the evidence for this? And you have Noble providing evidence that there is clear communication beyond the one-way causation, communication of the central dogma. There is communication not only from the DNA to the RNA to the organism. There is information that transmits from the organism to the genome. And one of the examples that he gave was the coronavirus, or it could be any virus, right? In terms of somatic hypermutation, you can have communication from the soma telling a particular aspect of the genome, a particular area of the genome, to hypermutate so that they can actually look for solutions to the particular pathogen that they're dealing with. Dawkins, like Noble said, doesn't even understand what is being communicated to him. What is being communicated to him is purposeful action. And I just want to add something to this, because we clearly, we can see, and Noble also has said this, that Dawkins doesn't really understand the biology. But there's something else that Denis Noble said, and I wanted your thoughts on this. Denis Noble said Richard Dawkins was using his rhetorical skills to win over a simplistic idea to the audience. And he was simply involved in, he didn't use these words, but the way he was describing it, I would describe it as sophistry. As in, he did use the word rhetorician, that he is a rhetorician, and he was using his public skills of oratory to oration skills for him to bypass the evidence under his nose, the evidence right in front of him. To bypass it, he'd repeat a mantra, and he felt there was rhetorical games being played. I wanted your thoughts on this, because this is something I really think is not highlighted post-debate.
Well, I think it's very true, because very clearly any person with a bit of knowledge about evolution and what they were talking about, Richard Dawkins, it was more of a case of repeating things that he'd been saying for a very long period of time. And the reason he says those things is because he has got a very clear dogma about his belief. And I mean, he's basically, he has, and one of the unintended consequences of his ruthless propagation of the idea of Darwinism is that he has made it an ontological view. Just like, when we make case for God, for example, one of the arguments people use is ontological argument for God, and it's a very difficult argument to make. I'm not saying it's philosophically flawed, but it certainly is something that it requires you a very particular level of intellect to understand that. For the most people, it is that because you believe something is true, then everything else makes sense, because what you're saying is that if you can conceive of God, therefore God must exist, and then everything else becomes easy to understand following that. Now, that, of course, is not what the argument is saying, but this is how people understand that. But if you replace certain terms from this argument and replace God with evolution and replace believers, Richard Dawkins, for example, well, he's exactly done the same thing with evolution. He has made it an ontological view that once you believe evolution to be true, then everything else becomes believable. So he's not doing what all good scientists should do, which is you examine the evidence, follow the evidence, and based on that you get to the conclusion. The destination is already predetermined, that this is exactly what it is, and then you use the different pathways to justify that conclusion that you had an a priori commitment to. And this is what he has done in the debate, and it's not the first time. I suspect it won't be the last time either. So he absolutely avoided every scientific evidence there. And as there was one moment in there, which was a bit of a boss man moment, I would like to call it, is when he was talking about placing Dr. Noble's genome, and then in many thousand years ago, recreating him. The moment he started talking, if you look at for a very brief moment in time, you look at the facial expressions of Dr. Noble has said, that's right, which means I know exactly what you're walking into. It's only that you don't know that. And when he talked about his, the 1936 egg of his mother and so forth, that's when Dawkins believed then it transpired to him that that's an oops moment, but it was a bit too late. But two more things I'd like to add to it. You mentioned what Dr. Noble he's been saying for some time now, that what the agency means is that there is a two-way communication there. So the organism, it passes the information to the cell, and then the cell produces certain proteins or mutations, whatever are required. So, for example, when cancer hacks into the body's defenses and it sends more messages to the cells to produce cancerous cells, okay, this is sort of a malfunctioning of body. But what it does establish is a two-way communication. So that you have the entire organism talking to the cell and the cell acting on that. When we had the idea of central dogma of genetics or the central dogma of biology, we always had a question which was always unanswered. And the central dogma is that the DNA giving instructions to the RNA going to the ribosome, and then proteins made, and then they were passed on, then they were given to the body because body needs proteins. Wonderful. The question that always was left unanswered was, where does the DNA get that information from? How does DNA know that what code would result in what protein? So we were the proponents of agency long before. But now when we know that the central dogma is no longer tenable, and it's a two-way communication, it's not the case that the journey starts from DNA. It actually starts from the body giving information to the DNA that this is what I require, and then the DNA executes those instructions. Then the question is, body might tell DNA that this is what I need, But does body or the organism also tell DNA that this is the exact set of instructions you need to generate? Or is it DNA still coming up with the idea on its own that if the body needs this, then I need to set this set of instructions, and then passes them on to the RNA, and then the proteins are made in the ribosome? That question is still there. And that question can never be answered by these contingent being, which was one of the questions I asked, which we played earlier. So the reason I want to mention this is that we don't want to just leave everything to the just hardcore cold materialism that this is what it is. No, there are a number of other questions which we have and that they need to answer. And if they can't answer that, at least what they should do is what Dr. Noble did, is that I don't know. I can't answer that. Such a noble way of conducting himself that, look, that's my limitation. That's the limitation of materialism. I can explain it to you that this is how it works. Why does it do so? I don't know. Something all these ruthless Darwinists, or neo-Darwinists, I should say, they just seem to not to have any sort of even idea that this is another way of coming across. It's simply, I don't know. But if you still believe that I'm wrong based on my lack of knowledge, you are anti-science. Say, how do I answer that?
That's a good way of putting it. If you don't understand due to my incoherence in explanation, then you're anti-science. When you were speaking, I double checked. I opened up the Kindle version to double check because I was trying to remember if Dawkins repeated the 10,000 year analogy that he said about the DNA sequence being written in granite and replicating Denis Noble, which Denis Noble obliterated that example, I thought to myself, I'm pretty sure he repeated the exact same example, even though it's refuted. So while you were speaking, I went to the Kindle version, I typed in granite, and he actually, you know what I'm going to do to make you laugh, right? Because it's quite late. It's good to laugh, right? He literally says this. Of course, the DNA information would need the biochemical infrastructure of an egg cell, which was the refutation in a womb, but that would be provided by any willing woman. The baby she bears, an identical twin of his 10,000 year dead predecessor, would be a living version of basically Denis Noble, right? Okay, the problem here is this. Denis Noble already explained to you the biggest problem with your example is this. The DNA doesn't allow for the creation of Denis Noble because it needs the egg of the mother. Now, which mother? Now, he says any willing mother. No, Denis Noble's mother, because the life experiences of Denis Noble's mother, the environmental pressures that she goes through, leaves genetic markers which function, which develop. So Denis Noble is a product of his DNA plus the experiences in his mother and his father's life, all of the experiences that they had, any genetic markers that are left over. It's so abundantly clear. We have the example, for example, in terms of World War II with the Nazis, they took over a particular area that made people go through starvation, and the metabolism of those children were affected. So there's something that happens in their lifetime which is carried on. Also, this is really, really important. The cell membranes, which has the conditional logic of life, the on, off, if, then, or, right, all of this stuff, the cell membranes, the lipid of those membranes, this stuff is not coded for in the genome. So look, for me, you know what I feel like, and Qaiser, you know this, when someone's losing a debate, it's sometimes best not to even deal with the opponent, right? In this case, Noble. What Dawkins is basically doing is, look, a lot of people are not going to understand the sophisticated language that we're using and the arguments on either side. So I'll just try and win over the audience. And if you go to the comment section of the debate between Noble and Dawkins, that's exactly what's happening. People are like, well, it was an amicable discussion between the two of them, but they've completely missed the point that Dawkins was totally refuted.
Yeah, and there we go. I mean, for him to say that any woman would do, I mean, this probably shows the type of problem we are dealing with. It's that level of arrogance. I mean, there was a time when epigenetics was discredited, it was frowned upon, it was seen as the enemy of science by neo-Darwinists. But you can't do anything about it because it's proven beyond any reasonable doubt. And the experiences, yes, they will be transferred to the next generation. Now we have the discovery of extracellular vesicles, the clearly information packets, as you mentioned earlier, from soma to germline, they do get transferred. If it were that simple, all you had to do was just take any woman in any situation and have the type of children you want. Why don't you? Because it's not just any woman.
It's not.
There is a
No,
biological mechanism. Yeah.
Yeah, and clearly, I think in this, by giving this particular example, it reiterates Dawkins doesn't understand what was being said to him, or he's being deliberately obtuse. It's one of the two. I want to play. Yeah, go on, carry on.
No, I was going to go with the former, not the latter.
Okay, that's fine. So I want to play one more clip, and I'm aware it's nearly 12 o'clock where you are, so we will wrap this up soon. But there's some interesting things that he says after you gave him the contingency argument, and I wanted your thoughts on that.
Now explained yours. I think that there is no doubt that we use speculations about what exists and what can function, even in our scientific theories. Whoever has met the square root of -1. Now, why is it important? It's important because nobody can ever have met something like that. You can't have a square root of -1 number of apples or number of bananas. Yet, in mathematics, that is an exceedingly useful idea. And I see many aspects of metaphysics as more or less in that kind of category. Just one example, if you take somebody like Jerry Coyne, a strong neo-Darwinist in the United States, in his book, Why Evolution is True, and what he's stated since then, he thinks about the question of our agency, and he says, and I quote almost exactly, we have an extraordinary illusion that evolution has developed in us, that we can choose, that we have agency is the way I would put it. But we don't. That's his belief, that's his metaphysics. We don't have agency.
That is metaphysics, yes.
That's right. And then he goes, that's where his metaphysics is. But then he goes on to the extraordinary statement. But we can ponder why evolution has developed this illusion in us. Now, what is pondering? It is thought. Thought about what? Do we agree with Coyne or disagree with Coyne? Are we not making a choice whichever way we go? And he is encouraging us to make that choice in the implicit understanding that he knows we've got agency, and yet he denies it. I conclude a physical argument to show why that is incoherent. And I think the test of metaphysics is it coherent? Does it form a logical whole? And I respect, therefore, religious believers who think they can see a logical whole in what they believe. Don't wish them to feel anything other than that if that's what they feel. But I also reserve the right to have my logical whole, which is my own metaphysics, which there is considerable doubt about what do we really know in the deep sense of these fundamental questions, which at the moment certainly we can't answer, and possibly, in my deeper feelings about it, possibly we will never answer. Maybe there just is a limit to what we can know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think that limitation is what makes us very exciting beings, because everybody is looking for the limitation at subjective level as well as at the objective level as well. And this
Yes.
experience for me, Dr. Noble, is such refreshing that I'm talking to a scientist who is humble enough to state that, look, if we don't know, we don't know. Because mostly my time is spent with Darwinists, and there's nothing like this. And, you know, we've discussed metaphysics, we've discussed the square root of -1, and obviously with the further imaginative exercises of going into the number pi and from there finding way into the quantum physics, and then wondering without metaphysics what one could do, given the fact that it was the imagination that opened the realm of something which took us to subatomic level, which is brilliant. And the metaphysics in that regard can't be denied. And what I wouldn't go as far as saying frustrates me, but what certainly surprises me is that the people, just like Jerry Coyne, you mentioned, that he used the one of the important modes, that is the agency, and then using that free will to conclude that there is no free will. I think it's quite consistent when it comes to favoring a very astute anti-religious view from a scientific premise. For example, Richard Dawkins is well famous for saying that the universe looks designed, but it isn't. Now, if we divide this statement into two parts and look at the first one and see whether it's a scientific statement, and quite clearly it is, because universe indeed looks designed. I mean, you can do the experimentation of it, you can do the observation of it, no problem. But the second part, that it isn't, is not a scientific statement, because we can't falsify it. We don't know.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, and that's a metaphysical claim right there. But then to use such claims to deny metaphysics and so forth. And again, I fully agree with you that the metaphysics can exist independent of religion. And it doesn't have to be religiously bound. But the way in which we look at it is the inquiry that takes us beyond what is physical, and then we find the answers, and we find the answers in the creator. That gives us closure, and obviously this is our way of thinking, and this is fascinating that, you know, we've come that close, and and now the difference is that a party claims to know and a party claims not to know. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I think it is. And I think this is the kind of discussion and debate we should be having. When I I referred to Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and I've talked with quite a number of religious leaders, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I've spoken to monks in East Asia, you know, in a totally different tradition there, because they've got a kind of, well, if I can put it this way, a kind of godless religion. They have a religion that doesn't include God. I mean, now, I don't pretend to understand a lot of this. What I can say, though, is this. It is absolutely fascinating discussing with such people. We're not talking about people who think the world is only 7,000 years old. We're not talking about people who think that there was some kind of set of magical tricks performed. We're talking about very serious thinkers about the deep questions to which we don't really have good answers. And my way of thinking about this is we should recognize that in each other. We're all struggling to make sense of what we find in the world.
What a wonderful attitude. And there's so many different things that could be said about that clip that we played. But the first thing I want to ask you is you put to him something which I hadn't actually thought about structuring in that way, but it's really, really good, which is the first part of the statement, the universe looks designed, but it's not. I mean, it looks designed, that's scientific. The second part is not. And he agreed with that. And that is the very argument we've been making for a very long time, that Dawkins is not talking from a scientific perspective. He's using science to push his atheism. He doesn't explain what is science and what is his own view. He presents it as the scientific view. And the problem is we take any statement by a scientist as a scientific statement, but it's a philosophically loaded statement.
Well, it certainly is. At the moment, I'm running a training program called A Science Fraud. And the whole premise is that we love science. We believe it's one of the best enterprises that the human beings have created. But the fraud or the fraudulent element in that is that there are certain metaphysical and philosophical beliefs, very dogmatic. They are being taught to people as science,
Yeah.
and they aren't. For example, materialism is one of them, scientism is one of them, methodological naturalism is one of them. These are all philosophies. One can agree to them or disagree to them, but when you force it upon people to the extent that a student can't get his degree or her degree, for that matter, without believing in what your dogma is, that's fraud. That's intellectual dishonesty. And this is what Richard Dawkins has been doing for a very long period of time. I mean, this statement that we mentioned here, this is one. But then there's another one. I think we also talked about it last time when we talked, when he was talking to Brian Greene. And Brian Greene said that, what if God exists? In his own humorous way. And Richard Dawkins said that, well, I'm not at ease with that notion. Because if God exists in a way that undermines our scientific enterprise, then, well, that's not going to be a good thing. I don't remember his material words, but basically he was denying that, even if that is the case, I would deny. Well, here is a problem. That if you're saying that if God exists, well, you are talking about so far as you're concerned, a hypothetical situation, but within that hypothetical situation, it is absolutely true that God exists. That is the only way you are going to entertain this argument any further. But if God absolutely exists, would you deny that existence only because it undermines your scientific enterprise? That's the only reason. So that is that rigid dogma, which is not science. It isn't. It's scientism. It's materialism. It's methodological naturalism, and a bunch of other isms with it. And you pretend that is science, and you compel other people to go along with that journey of pretense. That obviously is something that needs to be called out, and I certainly do that. And this is not just one example. You can find many, many more. The Jerry Coyne one was a very good example there.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been really great speaking to you. Mashallah, this interview is brilliant. I'm glad I got to see a version of it before the final that came up on YouTube, and so I got a sort of preview of it. But it definitely rattled my brain in terms of the divergence between Noble and Dawkins, and just how starkly contrasted they are theologically. Because, like I said to you at the beginning of the live stream, and I'm sure people who follow Noble will recognize this, no one's ever spoken to Noble in that way before. And, to understand these views of his is something quite novel for people to know. And it's something which, I commend you for. And I hope, in your future interactions, you can also give us more of this type of novel content, inshallah.
You're very, very kind. It really means a lot for someone like you to say things like that. It really, really means a lot to me. Thank you.
No worries. Jazakallah khair for your time. Before we end, is there anything you're working on we could tell the audience about?
Yeah, I'm writing 2 books at the moment, and I don't know why am I doing 2 of them together. Even one is difficult. The one book is about atheism, and it's a bit more philosophically affront causing. It's not a defensive book. It's basically the idea of taking atheism to cleaners, and intellectual cleaners, that is. Not, we wouldn't like to compromise on standards. The second one is going to be pretty controversial, but it's something that has got to be there. It's called the liberal jihad. It's basically how liberalism is by force. It is imposed on the rest of the world through different systems, through the means of war, through institutions, and through the creating the liberal international order, and how that unfolded from 1945 to all the way now.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And while you were talking about that, I was looking around to see if I could see Julian Huxley's book. New Bottles for New Wine. That's one of his books, and Religion Without Revelation. And Julian Huxley was a statesman and a atheist evolutionary biologist and a militant anti-theist, and he played a big role in anti-God attitudes in biology. So make sure to include him as well. And it's going to be a mammoth book, inshallah, and I'd love to have you back discussing your books.
Inshallah, I'll be back. Thank you. Really appreciate the respect. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.